Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our June MBN online webinar devoted to the timely topic of cybersecurity and the isolation economy. My name is Beata, and as a director of Malta Business Network, I am especially delighted to welcome our world-class event chairman today, Dr. Jacqui Taylor, the CEO and founder of FlyingBinary Limited, an expert advisor to the United Nations and European Commission, and named as one of the UK's 20 most impactful entrepreneurs. Dr. Jacqui, it's wonderful to have you chairing this event, and thank you very much for fitting in our modest micronation of Malta between your many endeavors with the world's largest nation from the United Nations down. The panel will be made of two other renowned professionals in the industry who will be sharing their views and perspective on cybersecurity. Lara, Head of Capacity Building Practice at Protection Group International, and Grahame, Director at Analysis International. Dr. Jacqui, over to you.
Thank you, Beata, and thank you to Malta Business Network for hosting this today. Delighted to be here. Good to see you both, Grahame and Lara, as well. And good afternoon to you all. So today, we're all here to support your cybersecurity journey as we unlock the isolation economy. That's what we've termed that at a global level in terms of the situation we're in now and the impact that cyber has had on our cybersecurity industry. And specifically, we're focused on getting your business cyber ready for a very different world as we unlock that isolation economy. So firstly, I'm going to give you an overview of the cyber work I do globally and bring you some insights and some takeaways from that. And then I'll bring in both Grahame and Lara to bring in their perspectives. And what I need to say as a theme set for what I will say is, whether it's as an expert advisor at the UN, the G20 or the European Commission, or if it's in my home country of the UK and the strategic advice we're doing as we're unlocking the economy. Equally, if I'm advising the Fortune 100 CXOs, all that advice centers on the fact we have a very different world we have to prepare for as we transition out of this pandemic. So I want to give you three perspectives that will start us on our journey, but look at it very much at a global level. First of all, I'm going to give you an overview of the cyber landscape before the isolation economy and give you the facts from that. And then I'll define what's happened and why we've called it the isolation economy from a cyber perspective. And then I'm going to share the top three things that really run as a golden thread across all of the advice that I've been giving over the last year since I delivered the G20's new plan. And I urge you to stay to the end because I've prepared a downloadable fact sheet for you to use, because we're going to give you an awful lot of information today. I'm also going to give you some takeaway information from the work, the research work in the World Economic Forum, and some insights for your work from home issues, some of which we may get into later. I've made it shareable though, so it's on FlyingBinary's own tech, and it'll enable you to share what I give you, web URL, to enable you to share it across your businesses, across your supply chains, to build your cyber capability. So a true takeaway. In terms of the cyber landscape, I'd say by the end of 2019, over 50% of the world was online. And according to the ITU figures, that means over 4 billion people. And so I speak to you this afternoon from somewhere outside of London. And I'm an international web scientist who doesn't just predict the future, I engineer it. And so this is the perspective that I give to the expert advisor roles that I hold. And the global online community has been increasing approximately 10% per year since 2005. But one thing as a web scientist I want to make clear from the outset is the World Wide Web is a fabric of permanence. And we've been using technology built on the internet itself to leverage that capability and to connect the world. And at a global level, we truly talk about it as a globalization mechanism to connect our world. And this technical revolution benefited every connected person based on their use of that technology. However, what we're here to talk today about is the dark side of that. And to just stay with the pre-pandemic side of things, IBM do a regular survey, and they literally looked at what would happen if we had a global cyber crisis pre-pandemic. And 77% of all the thousands of organizations they contacted said they were not prepared for a cyber crisis. And one of the things that's come to the fore as a result of the situation we find ourselves in is that insider threat was a real risk then and has been increasing since then. And I know Laura's going to unpack this for us all later. But one of the things I want to draw out from that is we've come to associate that risk with exposure of personal data. And based on the IBM report in 2019, 69% of companies admit that their employees and contractors were the source of the leaks. Now, obviously not predominantly maliciously, but as part of that ITU survey that we had for 2019, only 84 of the countries have data around the skill capability of our nations. And in 40 of those, less than 50% of the population has basic computer skills. Now you have a chat function in here, and it'd be interesting to know from an audience point of view, do you consider you have at least the basic digital skills? So if you would pop in the chat, a yes, no, or a maybe, that would be very interesting. And while you're doing that, it may surprise you to know that global survey, basic digital skills, in terms of the level that we have the data for, were considered to be, can you copy a file and can you use email? I'm expecting the delegates on this webinar to be able to say yes to that. But what that does actually give us, and that was our starting point from a G20 point of view, is that cyber hygiene is very poor across the countries we have data for. Thank you for that, Patrick. And so we have to assume it's worse for those countries where we do not have data, because you can't ever innovate or change on something you don't measure. And so in my specialty, I'm as a company, FlyingBinary builds deep technology for the industrial Internet of Things, so way beyond where most people are building for now. At the end of 2019, the setting for the G20, the new G20 plan for 2020, we had 9.5 billion connected devices. And I know from a cyber point of view, I would say they're being sprinkled across our world. They're being integrated into networks, they're in our supply chains, and of course, they're in our homes. Given that this pandemic has given us a work from home phenomenon like we've never seen before, as I said, an extra billion people, do any of you happen to know what the top connected device risk in your home is? And I'm thinking of businesses now where they're looking at hybrid working. Do you know where the risk sits? And again, a yes, no, or a comment would be good. I'll give you the first answer because obviously we're tight on time. A thermostat in your home is likely to be the biggest risk based on the criminal activity that goes on around them. But the key question I will have for you as businesses, what are the next 9 top cyber risks? Now I'm going to be, as part of the downloadable fact sheet I'll give you at the end, is to give you the global overview of cyber and that give you the numbers, but also to give you the top 10 cyber risks at home. While we have, at times probably a whole work from home workforce, but certainly a hybrid workforce for some time, it's really important that the work from home component of this is something that you look at. And the World Economic Forum research I'm sharing with you in that downloadable is not across all 180 countries that I work in, only the top 141 where we're able to assess cyber capability. But it will also give you an option of staying up to date with that research work as I launch the next initiative on the back of the UN work, which is the empathy economy that we founded out of the isolation that we've all suffered, and a membership offering where I'll share further resources, and we'll have a dedicated cyber safe community, which positions businesses for that post-isolation economy world. You can say yes or no to that, but the offer's there. And this was the known cyber landscape before the world at large was aware of the impending COVID-19 crisis, which of course would lead us to the pandemic we're in. And we know today that it's far from over. And although some nations are even out of these isolation economies, we still do not have a global vaccine program rollout across the world. And so we're still with this for some time to come. And just to set that context from a cyber perspective, we've it's demonstrated as a result of the pandemic, never seen before cooperation in organisations across nations and across our economies, and of course between the cyber criminals. And when work from home became the norm for over 1 billion people, the most well-prepared cohort for this change, which I'm sure Lara and Grahame will touch on, were the cyber criminals. Why? They already work online. And every nation has struggled with this phenomenon of work from home in this pre-vaccine pandemic world. And from a cyber security point of view, it's been just like a zero-day exploit across the entire world, which we haven't planned for, as I've already said. And I take no pleasure for having predicted this in January 2019 in my Davos speech when I was talking about the future of our industry, our cybersecurity industry. And so if you need to focus now, where are you going to focus on while we have this hybrid world? The biggest cyber risk right now is people, which means we need to focus on strengthening teams. We need collaboration, not just across our organizations now, but also across our supply chains. What I call the value chain, i.e. the value of what we bring to the world. We're all going to have to continue hiring and managing virtually, and that brings its own risks. But essentially, if you approach this problem as the isolation economy has effectively accelerated a new social contract, which is predominantly online. So work from home is a reality for our future. For us at FlyingBinary, we were formed online 12 years ago. It's our future from day one and will continue to be. But the work I do across the world at a global level, one thing we're agreed upon is nation states can't drive the sort of collaboration that we're going to need to move the needle forward, such that the cyber criminals are not the ones in complete control. But our organizations can, and our supply chains can, and networks like the Malta Business Network can, which is the reason this is such an important webinar. And the underpinning piece is that tech is the driver for all organizations now, but it also makes everyone vulnerable. And essentially what I'm asking you to do is position how you view cybersecurity today as an operational risk, not just for your organization, not just for your teams, but for yourself. And essentially say we're due a revival now of the cybersecurity industry. It's inevitable based on the planning that all governments are doing. So what's next? What is the road to recovery? Now, I want to give you one context, which may or may not be in your frame of reference yet, but 2.7 billion devices are predicted to be connected to 5G by 2025, less than 4 years from now. Now, in FlyingBinary, because of the work we do across the world, we're already working on the 6G, 7G arena from a research perspective, from a cyber perspective, but we haven't launched those commercial products yet. But it's a totally different cyber risk scenario, whether it's where you are now or it's where you're heading or where you didn't know to head. And the key changes that we've done at a global level is to focus on the fact this is a distributed set of technology, not centralized. And the overarching shift that's been made in the last year, particularly with G20 countries, is different business models, different ways in which policy landscapes change. So this is not a commercial model play. By changing your commercial model, that's not the way out of this. That's not how we unlock the economy. And at a basic level, the cyber perspective that we've done from a global response is threat-based approaches won't work. They certainly won't work for the industrial Internet of Things where FlyingBinary deploys its technology, but risk-based approaches are the core proposition, not just for the industrial Internet of Things, but for now, as we unlock the isolation economy. And essentially, from a technical point of view, what I would say to that is we're discounting edge services now. The architecture is distributed, as I've said, and we're focused on core and endpoint services. So what does that mean? Now, this is a big, big subject, and I've taken 3 top next steps, which were the core of the G20 plan that I delivered in February 2020, but it also have been rippling across the world. And what we've done as a response is a cloud-first strategy. Now, FlyingBinary has a cloud-only strategy. I know most of you won't be aiming for that, but some of you may. But a cloud-first strategy is a must. And that is a seminar in itself, took several days from a G20 point of view to discuss. But what I would say to you as a message to your board, or if you are the board, your one most important takeaway is around deep technology that we build at FlyingBinary. And what I would say is, if there's no cloud first strategy, there's no AI in your organization, and leveraging that tech is actually going to be a struggle. So the second one is, as part of the global plan for the G20 economies, we had many things in the individual assessments of the economies, but there was one key cyber category that was true for all G20 members, and that was the critical national infrastructure. And I've already done training on this across the G20, but beyond all of that, Fortune 100 CXOs have it top of their list now, and we're following up with leadership and excellence on their workshops. And what that means is dependency of organizations on the critical national infrastructure is firmly on the board agenda, and it's top of the strategic changes for these organizations. You may well have seen the recent announcement from the US administration of a task force to mobilize that national capability. And I can also let you know today that work is underway across all G7 nations, so not just the UK and the US. And more than that, all G7 technology ministers have signed a declaration to collaborate on the future of technology changes with that as an underpinning. And the UK has stepped forward with the announcement of primary legislation to mandate this change. And then an additional piece which might not be in people's sights is we're specifically in the UK going to legislate to create a new duty of care to protect UK citizens online. That's a world first, but that signals a huge change and shift for our cyber industry. The UK holds the G7 presidency in 2021, and we've got a number of announcements to make, but I would say we already have a number of follow-on countries ready to mobilise beyond the G7. And just to put that in context, 58% of global GDP is already signed up to the agenda that I'm talking about. But you might think, well, why does this matter to me? And I would say during this crisis, I'm assuming your supply chains have been under pressure, or in some of our clients' cases, much worse than that. Have you updated contingency and resilience plans? And that, again, happy that you put comments in the chat. And that's a yes or no option, because if you haven't already, the cybersecurity numbers download I'll give you at the end will allow you to prepare to get that conversation going, or as a cross-check to any work you've already done. And obviously, we've had a number of repeated critical national infrastructure attacks. And essentially that changes the landscape for technology about what we might do later in terms of what we might do now. And I want to give you a view as to how people are approaching that, managing that new cyber risk, given the CNI attacks are on the increase. So I'm one of the 6 data protection practitioners of excellence, recognised by the UK's Information Commissioner in 2020 for my cyber work in the industrial Internet of Things. And we've actually spent time over the pandemic helping people leveraging the GDPR preparations that we did back in 2018 into its new form. And many organisations have already started mobilised on this. Based on the landscape work, we know that 500,000 organisations have hired a data protection officer. Japan has moved its entire regulatory regime, as of California, and the CCPA Act is already making its changes across the other states. But what is actually has been a wholesale shift in the isolation economy is what's called a RegTech approach, a regulatory technology approach. And that's actually one of the key pieces that with a cloud-first strategy, people are using, organizations are using, nations are using to unlock the isolation economy. It lets the technology do the heavy lift and shift, but it also prepares your organization for the new cyber landscape. So I'm just going to pop that URL link for the free download with the information I'm giving you today in the chat now. And lovely to see the questions and the comments in there. Now that's a global perspective to bring you right up to date. And I'd like to introduce you now to Grahame White. I know Beata's already said he's the director at Analysis International. And the company is a bespoke financial intelligence and analytics advisory and training company with a global footprint and a client base across financial sector and public sector. So many banks and financial services organizations rely on Analysis International to improve employee skills in an artist and that due diligence capability. So I want to hand you over to Grahame, and I'll let you take the next stage. Thanks, Grahame.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Jacqui. And good afternoon to everybody. First of all, my congratulations to Malta in regards to the Moneyval review. Very pleased that things are going very well for you now. But as we all know, there's a lot more to be done. And I mean, this is a very timely session to be, shall we say, to be bringing to the table. They're resourceful, they are clever, and we need to be the same. And with the likes of Jacqui and Lara, you know, I think we're in good hands going forward. Okay, so I'm just going to add some current context in relation to the European Union, which is where I seem to resonate mostly. There's a lot of focus, I would say at this moment in time, in terms of dealing with threats and challenges. And from a regulatory perspective, there's plenty of guidance identifying cyber criminality as a risk, as a clear risk. The EBA, European Banking Authority, and the European Central Bank have identified IT and cyber risks as serious threats, particularly in financial services with real focus on identification and management of risk. For me, that's a good thing because it includes appropriate oversight and training for managers and senior board members. Let's not forget the senior board members. Lots of buy-in and a top-down culture would be very much welcome, of course. There's a constant need for expertise and training to assess and defend against cyber risks. And that doesn't just include the private sector, believe you me. There's a real commitment to tackling these evolving threats. Modernizing law enforcement as well is quite important, as is stamping out illegal content online and the, shall we say, the massive increases we've seen in relation to that. There's a discussion around a new network and information systems directive to be introduced as Europe looks to standardize its, shall we say, its capabilities in regards to financial crime, money laundering, and so on. A joint cyber unit for Europe is also under consideration. Jacqui and Lara might have more information on that than I do. But not only is the EU going to standardize its approach across the member states, but it wants to, shall we say, introduce better standards to third-party countries going forward as well. Malware, data theft, identity theft are in the increase. Jacqui talked very briefly about insiders. A lot of data breaches, 34% of data breaches are committed from the inside. So there's another area that needs focus. And also, as well as the EU is looking to improve the investigation capability of law enforcement. Where they were, I needed them 25, 30 years ago. Where they are now would be very, very useful to find out. Particularly in the areas of artificial intelligence, big data, and high performance. So that's realistically, that's one of the focuses we want to do, is look at, shall we say, including performance across law enforcement, and from my perspective, not before time. In general, the technology we have available, which shapes our lives, unfortunately, as Jacqui touched on in relation to the thermostats, well, it's become a platform for sophisticated and resourceful cyber criminals. It's not just banks, governments, and companies who are getting hit, as we say. It's, you know, it's individuals too. Criminals have different motives, of course. Financial gain, political manipulation, of course, as well as financing criminal activity. Which, if I get the chance to put the slide deck up in a few minutes, if I can make that work, then I'll show you a good example when we look at the Quas network, because it's not just about, you know, stopping and addressing cyber risks in terms of the session. It's also about, shall we say, highlighting one or two successes. I don't think it would do any harm to do that. I think that's quite important. Stopping and addressing cyber risks requires good preparation. And as the technology has developed, so has the criminal enterprise. And we can't forget that. I do think at this moment in time, it's debatable as to whether the criminal justice system and law enforcement has kept pace. And only recently are public and private sector organisations waking up to the seriousness of the problem. And obviously more needs to be done in that space. So yes, I'm going to put up my slide deck now, Jacqui, if that's okay with you. I think it wouldn't do any harm to have a bit of visual on it. Okay, can everybody see that? Can I just have some acknowledgement? Yes, thank you, Jacqui's giving me the nod.
Good.
Okay, I've got a question for you, actually, and I actually came up with it this morning when I was reviewing what I was going to be discussing with you, and it's in relation to this first slide. If we look at point 2, which talks about cybercrime, and this is the takeaway from the cybersecurity strategy model for Malta. Where else could I go? It's perfect for what we're talking about. It identifies 6 key areas, and we're going to cover some of those today. But I look at point 2 and point 5. So cybercrime and cybersecurity awareness and education. So if you want to put, I've got a question for you. I'll throw it out in the audience. You can put your answers into chat. So think of your own circumstances. Think of your own organization. Who needs to be educated and who needs to be aware? And I think would probably be an interesting, shall we see, a series of answers come back. I'd be very curious in regards to that one. I'm just going to move it down to the next slide. Some examples: resourceful, shall we say, sophisticated, ruthless. Yeah, we know all the bad adjectives in relation to criminals, as we know. Fraud au président was around about 640 million dollars over the past 4 years. And this is where it becomes, shall we say, a personalized attack in relation to an organization, where they're highlighting an individual within the organization. They're coercing the person, putting them under pressure to carry out an act on behalf of someone considered to be, shall we say, senior within the business. One French company about 2 years ago was hit for around about 500,000 euros, where the accountant was put under pressure to make the payments on behalf of the CEO of the business on the basis of the emails that she was receiving from the person she thought was the CEO, when in fact it wasn't. So 500 went through on 5 separate tranches. Good work done by the bank, who stopped 4. But within 10 minutes, that organization had lost just about 100,000 euros. So, and as I put at the bottom, we're talking about, should we say, exploitation from a home environment, working from home, COVID-19. How safe and secure are we? Are our systems at home as good as what they should be in relation to perhaps what they are in the office? And I wouldn't be surprised if there's been 1 or 2 interesting, shall we say, examples and stories to be, shall we say, alluded to in this session. So COVID-19 has had an impact, as Jacqui's quite rightly shall we say, highlighted at the start of the session. I like this one. I like this one, ladies and gentlemen, because it's all about social media. Because I love social media. Because I'm not very good at it. I don't make a lot of use of it, but criminals do, and I thank them very much for continuing to put their lives out online for me to have a look at. This is called vishing. It's a guy called Fizan Chowdhury, who actually took around about 60 million. Through a sophisticated network, 60 million euros and pounds from a number of, shall we say, organizations and individuals based out of the UK. He had insider support from the Damarola sisters here. Shall we say, insiders, yes, motivated, greed, of course, isn't it always, or nearly always? And what they were doing was providing him with bio data and banking data in regards to customers. He was then setting up a sophisticated system, and I'm going to make this available to you as part of the takeaway. He was making this, shall we say, this sophisticated system of setting up a network of making calls to victims. We know the story. We've heard it all before. Your account is in trouble. There's been a hack or there's been an issue on your account. Please provide us with all the relevant information, and I'll buy myself a Lamborghini, a Rolls Royce, 3 Range Rovers, and my wedding will be paid for by you. And that's the kind of thing, we're trying to stop, because it's individuals, shall we say, their accounts being, shall we say, hit on, and the money's being, shall we, spirited away. Good result at the end of the day in regards to Fizzy. Tried to get out of the UK through Paris on a forged Pakistani passport, failed miserably, and he's currently doing 15 years in prison for money laundering and various associated offences. Well done us. That's a good one for us, isn't it? And I'm going to finish up with the next one. With this, now this again is a sophistication. Now this is the Quas network. Now I like these examples because the Europol, European Union, they put out a lot of these press releases, corporate releases in relation to successes. And this is quite a sophisticated operation. It's a money laundering scam, series of, shall we say, online front companies set up by the Quas network from Eastern Europe. They've established multiple shell companies and this network of corporate and personal bank accounts. And what they were doing is they were making them available to cyber criminals and to hackers. and effectively saying as well, once you've hit the individuals or hit the companies, we'll place the money in the system for you, but we're going to charge you 45 to 50% commission to do so. The reason being was quite simple, is because they knew at some stage they'd get found out, and therefore they knew they'd have to take a hit. But they perpetrated this for 2 or 3 years across Europe, basically became a bank drop service. And setting up sort of company accounts and mule accounts, originated a lot from Portugal because they were in the position to infiltrate the company, shall we say, as provider network in that country. They worked through 2 websites, dark web forums. Well, one was verified. The other one was called Masafaka, which cost $10,000 per annum to administer, create the mule accounts, and then take advantage of the ease of creating shell companies in Portugal. Business accounts would obviously allow for larger transfers to avoid scrutiny. Started in 2016, and the accounts were created, authenticated with counterfeit documentation. And as you can see at the bottom, they would be in the position to charge the cyber criminals up to 40 or 55% for the actual laundry process. So you think where we were many years ago in terms of front companies and mules and money laundering, look how sophisticated the networks are becoming. So that's just a very, very short, quick slide in relation to that. Got more information for you. Again, don't forget the insider aspect. Of course, it's an area that we do need to sort of, shall we say, give focus to, particularly in protection of data. Very, very important. What motivates, the insider? How do we deal with it? How do we set up some sort of defense process in relation to that? That requires accountability, and that needs, as I said, the top-down culture. That's important. Strengthening the accountability, it's a constant theme within financial services business. It also leads to issues like reputational risk, which, there is no excuse nowadays for dealing with cyber matters. Even if you're not successful, there needs to be a process in place to actually say address the problem or look as if you're addressing the problem. I still think with a number of organizations, there is a tendency to deal with it once it's happened. And that is not the way forward. It needs to be addressed, shall we say, it needs to be addressed, and we need to invest in training, systems, and a risk assessment, because those who've got a risk assessment in place do stand a better chance of resisting an attack. And that's, I think that will do for me for the time being, Jacqui, and I'll hand it back to yourself to move it on to Lara. Okay?
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Grahame. I think really good to have the landscape view of the EU security strategy. I did just want to pick up on one thing around your view on how important it is to have an accountability framework around that insider threat, around the data theft and that perceived lack of security, because it's complex what you've described, but that accountability, as you say, is key. Could you talk a little bit more about that for us? Well,
yes. I mean, fundamentally, you see, we see a lot of issues around insider threat indicators. And as I mentioned in terms of the slides, I don't think there is enough work is being done within organizations in terms of a senior level to address the problems. And I think more needs to be done at that stage. You have a situation with many organizations where, you might have one senior figure who's, shall we say, IT competent. And I use the term very broadly, of course, being a person who comes from a very, very different generation. I don't think that can be allowed any further. We're talking about making senior figures within organizations accountable for money laundering. And we've heard all the stories. We've seen all the fines, everything that comes out of the regulatory authorities in terms of scrutiny and sanctions against organizations. That will obviously apply in terms of cyber, shall we say, attacks as well, because the questions will be asked by the regulatory authorities is, what have you got in place to stop this kind of thing happening, particularly if it's customer focused. And if you're not up to scratch, if you're not up to standard, then realistically you can expect the same kind of sanction that you would for a normal, shall we say, a normal or recognized AML challenge or failings that we're seeing today. So.
Yeah, that's points well made, Grahame. Thanks. If you could stop sharing your screen, that.
Yeah, my apologies.
Well, no worries. I think the thing is that links directly back into the RegTech, the regulatory technology approach that we're finding is one of the ways in which we've been mitigating these risks as the increased cyber activities happened through the pandemic. So I think that chimes well, and that accountability then is proven because you've got tech doing the heavy lifting shift. But I think what you're saying is it's got to be a top-down approach, but it's got to ripple the levels. So you had a few answers in the chat about who needs to have this education and awareness. So perhaps you might like to say whether we got it right. Do you want to have a look at the chat?
Yes, I will. I'll go into that. I was conscious of time because I want to hear what Lara's got to say. So, okay.
Yeah, me too. But I think pretty much we've all said everyone. So whether we got that right or not, you might want to just reply. Yeah, so thank you again for that, Grahame. That was brilliant.
No worries.
And I'd like to introduce you all to Lara Pasmell. Now, Lara leads the Protection Group International Capacity Building practice, and she's working primarily with, or the practice is working primarily with national governments and multilateral organisations, building not just capability but capacity for nations to manage the digital risk that we've been talking about already. And she tells me that her passion remains the distribution of information and its impact on public opinion and debate. And so, as a co-founder of the data journalism industry, couldn't have put it better myself. Delighted to have you here today, Lara. Can you give us your take on this debate, please?
Thanks, Jacqui. First of all, I'd like to thank the MBN for inviting me to speak today. I think that the topic and the subject is so broad that I think, you know, this 1 hour is it's quite mean to try and cover all this in 1 hour. And as you were speaking, and also as Grahame was speaking, I was reflecting on what I was going to talk about today, and I was trying to put myself in the perspective of the audience as business operators and industry, and try to distill some of the noise and perhaps focus on being a little bit more practical. So traditionally, my background is working with national governments, looking at national security. We build capability to ensure that nation states become more cyber resilient. So if I had to translate that down to a business perspective, one of the things that you said in your setting the scene, which I really liked, was you cannot innovate or improve anything you do not measure. And I think in measurement, you kind of understand. So as an organization, as industry players, I think the first thing that an organization needs to focus on is really understanding what their assets are. So having a good measurement and a good understanding of the things that you would like to protect because they're central to your business operation. I think that is possibly the first thing I would do if I were thinking about building a more cyber resilient organization. Once I have that measurement or understanding, the next thing that I would think about is try and understand what sort of risk I'm subject to. And there's all types of risk. And you need to understand from a business perspective which risks you really care about and which ones you will tolerate. And that kind of gives you an understanding of where you're going to start making your investment. Once you have this sort of comprehensive picture of the space that you want to navigate, you kind of need to understand the different job roles that are required in order to protect those assets. And I think there are very, very good international frameworks that can be used there. You know, one of the questions is, how do you train your people? How do you build cyber workforces? How do you build cyber capability within your own businesses? And a really good way to start is possibly looking at some certification that is broad and a great intro for graduates and IT staff. And some of these are, many of you will know these, CompTIA Networks Plus and Security Plus certifications is a really good way to start if you haven't actually thought, you haven't invested in cybersecurity up until now. So that is one of the key points that I wanted to make, given what we've been talking about in terms of risk management and understanding the threat, because it's so broad and I think it can be incredibly overwhelming if you're just starting to think about this. So that was my first point. Obviously, we spoke about insider threats. Grahame made a very good point about awareness and education. Where do you start? I think the most important people to make aware at the start of your journey is your board, because your board is responsible for your budgetary allocations and you need a budget or a funding stream in order to invest in capability. And then obviously there's broader awareness and ensuring that cyber hygiene, as we understand it, becomes so day-to-day and basic. It kind of becomes habitual, like the way we think about brushing our teeth, basically. You know, that is the level of habit that we need to develop. Yeah, so I think those are the two key points that I would focus on if I were beginning to think about investing in cybersecurity for my organization. And then one thing which I thought was really interesting within a Maltese context is because I think business reputation is very important. And I think perception is also very important. And there are two parallels here. One is, how do you position yourself within the national community to contribute towards your national resilience? And the other is, how do you position yourself with your customer base or your client base to make sure that you are establishing relationships of trust so that your business can grow and that you are seen to be taking cybersecurity very seriously and being part of that supply chain. So on the first one, I think a very practical thing business representatives and industry can do is engage with, for example, your national incident response organization. I think within the Maltese context, Beata is the government entity that coordinates national incident response. So that's you as an industry player contributing to national cyber resilience. And the second is being very transparent about the actions that you're taking in terms of building cybersecurity capability. One of the very important things, Grahame, you mentioned this, is about standards and certification of supply chains. You know, that is really important to be transparent about the certifications that as a business organization you're investing in, so that you can establish that trust and the trust goes along the supply chain. So I'm a big fan of conversations. So I think I will stop there and hopefully take a couple of questions, if that's okay, Jacqui.
Yeah, that's great, Lara. We do have a couple in here. I think I like the idea of the conversations, and it's an engagement piece that we need to do, and from a point of view of available in the country, and therefore, you know, outreach is key. But then, and with your client base, I just wondered whether that can be even wider. So is that messaging to your client base? Do you hold events to get people together? So based on the way you're talking about approaching it, making it a human thing, which I fundamentally do agree with, how would you start that process off? Would the Malta Business Network be a place to do this? That type of thing. Just a little more information on that.
Yeah, actually, I think, membership groupings such as the MBN obviously can have an active role in terms of driving a cybersecurity discussion. Essentially, this is what we're doing today, right? We are opening the space to have a cybersecurity discussion. So, yeah, I think my answer would be yes. The point I was trying to make was, not only do you have a responsibility to like the national cyber resilience and also making sure your business operations are secure or you are managing the risk as best you can. I think we have a responsibility because it's such a multi-stakeholder sort of endeavor, right, building resilience, that possibly if we are receiving that messaging and we're understanding it and we're being proactive about our cyber risk management, then we probably need to pass on the baton and share that with our client base or our customer base, whatever our community or constituency is.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that on the back of that, it occurred to me when you were talking that it's creating something very visible that demonstrates that you're doing that activity. So making visible what you're doing, and not from a point of view of giving a good impression. I'm taking care of my cyber hygiene or strategic cyber practice. But how would you go about doing that? You know, obviously you do the outreach you talked about, but is there a way that a company can beyond say certifications can demonstrate that they step forward I just wonder what else there might be, because I think it's really important, based on what we've all said today, to be more visible in this conversation and contribute.
So when you're talking about the relationship between industry, a business organization, whatever, with their customer base, or you're talking about like a national dialogue?
Just as a company, I was thinking, you know, for your organisation to say we stand forward on this, you've obviously got the things that you're talking about. How would you give the right sort of signals out that you as a company are doing this? I mean, is that something that you would have a discussion on your website? Would you have? I know some organisations have ambassadors for this sort of thing. And I'm thinking really from an organisation point of view, because there's a lot of practical resources that you're saying, but I think it's a step up message we're all giving, isn't it? I just wonder if there's anything else.
I think I would invest in certification, making sure that my organization has up-to-date, adequate and appropriate certification. And I think this goes beyond whether my business is a tech business or a cyber business. It could even apply to a carpentry business, right? You can have accreditation, because obviously you've got digital assets, even if you are a carpentry business. I think that is one step. The second step would be investing and training in my business workforce, right? Whether I'm a company of 5 people or 50 or 100, you know, is really investing in the training of my business workforce with relevant accredited training, for example, to make sure that I'm building the resilience internally as well as externally.
Yeah. And that makes perfect sense. And I know that the conversations that I've been having is we've been demonstrating positive P&L results of doing exactly what you're talking about, because it can become a company's USP that they are standing up to be that. But I've also found that it resonates really well with your board if you can do all that you said and you can demonstrate some positive P&L as a result of it. But I do believe it can be a differentiator in business, and also in specific sectors. Whilst we might have somewhere like financial services that perhaps do that on a more regular basis, point well made by you to say, but it's everybody, it's every business, not just the ones that perhaps are actively involved in the financial transfer of money. It's all about businesses. So I think that's really, really good advice. Grahame, I was going to say there's a question coming from you, but I was just going to on that by all means.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jacqui. I just wanted to sort of just add a bit more to what Lara was saying there. I mean, some notes I've made in relation to the session. So for me, there's, in terms of response, in terms of training, there's 2 areas, potentially 3 areas. One is training to stop cyber criminality, or raising awareness of it. That's the first thing. But also, just as equally important, is training to respond to the attack after it's taken place. And I say that from the point of view that a well-ordered response is more appropriate, because you've got a better chance of, if it's money that's been lost or data, whatever, you've got a better chance of getting that back, shall we say, quicker. So the response has to be trained as well. I think that's vitally important. And just to touch back very briefly back into the insider situation, it's also important to train your staff, train your team, your management, to recognize different abnormal behaviors within individuals working within the organization as well, particularly when I'm talking about potential data breaches occurring, because that's obviously something that needs to be focused on as well. So I'd like to think I've just added a little bit more there to the point that Lara was making.
Yeah, I think you have, and again, focusing on the practical is really helpful. I can see that Deborah's asked a question. Deborah, I've actually been doing the research on that originally from a G20 point of view, but that data is not available for me to say, unfortunately. However, from a European point of view, Deborah's asking about how SMEs are doing in this regard. Are they engaged and are they equipped? On average, 58% of all cyber attacks, in terms of the number of attacks, are against SMEs. And so, and it can be obviously catastrophic for their businesses, because largely they're not equipped. And I've taken it on myself to create that response. So that's what the Empathy Economy online membership is actually about. So based on the work I've done in the United Nations, I'm actually going to be giving SMEs that plan. Obviously on FlyingBinary tech with no access to the criminals, so they'll never know when we're coming or how equipped we are. But it's a really good question, Deborah, because in Europe, 99.5% of our economy is SMEs. So yeah, good question. Grahame, I've got a question that I think is yours, because based on how I love the way in which you outlined that we're making progress on some of these attacks. But the question was, attackers are smart. They've got smart tools, which of course we're all using too, and they use them to attack from a criminality point of view. But they're also using very smart methods to lure end users, you know, making things seem as real as possible. And the question is, do we have smart tools as well to protect against these attacks? And are we actually using those tools optimally? Which I thought was a great question. Grahame, you're on mute.
Yeah, my apologies.
No worries.
Shows how good I am, eh, guys? But no, I'd like to think we have. You know, I come from a security and services background in relation to the capabilities in terms of, shall we say, trying to stop and identify issues. There are many, shall we say, systems in place out there that are available. You know, to touch back in regards to what we've talked about in terms of the culture, it generally often comes down to cost. You know, in terms of who is prepared to pay for a better, shall we say, security system from an IT perspective. There are many out there, and that's all I can say in regards to that. But yeah. I know one or two particular. But I'm not making any endorsements at this moment in time. I'm here to enjoy myself. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to pick up on the point that you made, Hubert, in the chat, many businesses are generally slow to invest, and that's true. And no tangible ROI. I think that's an interesting comment, because in the RegTech arena, we've made tangible ROI. And the numbers I currently have at a global level are ×2. The investment you make, and our biggest win has been a ×60 investment, 60 investment. So it depends how you're looking at ROI, and in a regulatory context, it can now be predicted on that, and that obviously is music to the CFO's ears. So hopefully that helps you a bit. I think there's a number of other questions that have come in. And I think I'd like to tackle this one, because it's talking about very practical things like how often should you require users to change their passwords? I'm sure we'd all have a different answer on that one. And I think that gets to the basic cyber hygiene questions that we've all touched on today. And the follow-up question is multi-factor authentication and a password manager a necessity for all businesses? Now, obviously, we're all talking generically here in terms of any advice you give directly to a business. This is a very generic set of advice. But what I would say is we've just had a research piece go across the cybersecurity industry around things like password managers. And there are 3 key things that we who use password managers are not doing. So I'm not going to launch that here. I'm not quite sure how widespread that information is. But I don't know how anybody is doing basic cyber hygiene personally without a password manager. But the one thing I will say is, where are you storing your password to your password manager? Because that's one of the gotchas that I find often when I ask that question. In terms of multi-factor authentication, it really depends on your setting. But if you're not using 2-factor authentication, I'm worried about you. So that's quite practical question that was coming there. And I thought it was just good to do that, as well as the more strategic ones. I
think it's also about storing sensitive data and sensitive files. That's important, as well as who you're giving access rights to. I think that's equally important as well. Sorry for that, Jacqui. I just thought I'd throw.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. It's a really broad piece about, you know, where we pick this up, and I think it needs to be specific to your organisation, because there's no generic. There's plenty of gotchas, but the reason I gave the 3 takeaways from the global work is those 3 exist in all the plans, but they vary wildly between country to country, organisation to organisation, because it's really a contextual thing. I thought this one was an interesting one, and Lara and Grahame, you may have a view on this. Why do 63% of cybersecurity professionals, including 7 out of 10 CISOs, believe, chief information security officers, believe that cyber warfare is a threat to their business. I think we know it's a threat to our business. But what I will say is, from the World Economic Forum research, we know that only 9% of the chief information security officers have business expertise. They don't come from the business, they start in cyber. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but they do carry the load, mostly of the cyber responsibilities for their businesses. And one of the key changes has been to make a more holistic response. And essentially that cybersecurity, as we've all pointed out today, that cybersecurity response actually sits at board level now. That was already migrating that way before this pandemic. It firmly sits with the board now. And that doesn't mean to say that the CISO is on the board necessarily, but it does mean that there is a key cyber role that sits on that board. Often it's connected with what Graham's just mentioned, the data side of things, that might be the DPO, the data protection officer. But that's why so many professionals say it, because they're the broadest shoulders in most businesses. They're carrying the load. I don't know if either of you want anything to add to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it just takes me back to the point I made earlier about a risk assessment. You know, you have to have a comprehensive risk assessment in relation to the threat to the business. But as I say, in terms of how your ability to respond to that, you know, it's about identifying the threat, taking the action, and so on, and that's vitally important. But you're right in terms of, you know, again, just to re-emphasize the point, you can't just leave it with the CISO. It's no longer just the responsibility of that person. The board's got to buy in. The board must take more responsibility for it. I think that's absolutely vital. You know, it takes you almost back into the compliance world, doesn't it? You know, it's you know, we're not making money from it, therefore we don't really invest in it. You know, and that's, you know, obviously, because most of my work is done within the financial sector, and that's an area obviously that culture needs to sort of be addressed, and is being addressed, I hasten to add, by many organisations today.
I think sometimes it's vice versa. Actually, investing in cybersecurity should be looked at as an economic driver, because what you do not know, you don't obviously, what you're not aware of, you can't understand, and you can't actually include in your P&L. There was a question earlier about this, because it is intangible, and that is why it's really important. Going back to what Jacqui said right at the beginning, on you cannot innovate or improve anything unless you're measuring it. And really understanding what your assets are as an organization, whether you're public sector or private sector, is key. Once you understand what your assets are, then you can actually have a solid cyber risk assessment, understand what your threat is, what you're going to tolerate and what you're not. I'm going to keep that quote, Jacqui. I'm going to keep quoting you when I speak, because I really like it.
Well, that was the basis on which to get the G20 to change their entire mind about what they're going to do. So it's worked well for me so far for 60% of the world's GDP. You use it wherever, Lara. You've got my permission. I know that we need to bring this to a close now, because we're almost out of time, as we all said at the beginning. It's a huge area. But I want to first of all say thank you to Malta Business Network for doing this. This is a foundational piece and a foundational webinar in order to start to build that capability and put the offering that you have as a country on the map, and to move that forward. I want to say thank you to Lara and Grahame, and all your contributions, and really the people have said in the chat about how valuable all of this is, which is brilliant. So thank you again for that. I've got a couple of things I want to say as well, which is we're actually preparing something to build on the back of this webinar, based around financial services who are dealing with this, as Grahame's mentioned, on a day-to-day basis, and to make the case for how that can be a knowledge share piece as well. But it'd be specifically for the Malta Business Network members. So if you're not already a member of MBN, I do suggest that you look to join, because that will be closed doors on that. We'll be sharing some things amongst the members. And that's likely to be in September. We haven't got a date yet, but again, all members will get notification of that. And so you'll basically be able to build on what we shared today, from learning practices from financial services, and then to look at it in a multi setting, which obviously be particularly useful. So thank you all very much. I don't know, Beata, if you're going to come in at the very end.
Well, I made a couple of quotations as well, Lara, so I'm going to also make a little conclusion with a couple of handy quotations. I don't just predict the future, I engineer it. Dr. Jacqui Taylor, a cloud-first strategy is a must. 2.7 billion devices will be connected to 5G by 2025. Well, world population is expected to be 8.2 billion people by then, so 30% will have 5G smart devices by then. Some of us probably more than one. On average, 58% of EU cyber attacks are on SMEs, and clearly those can be catastrophic for small businesses where 99.5% of the European economy is SMEs. Nation states can't drive forward the cooperation that we need to defend against the cyber criminals. Tech is the driver for all organizations now. We need all our networks to be prepared, including the Malta Business Network. Thank you, Dr. Jacqui Taylor. I have to say that you're rightly named one of the UK's most impactful entrepreneurs. You definitely left an impact on us. Thank you, Grahame White, and thank you, Lara. That was an excellent session. As Jacqui mentioned, we are going to have a follow-up in a couple of months, and this will be closed session for MBN members only. For all brings us excellent insights to diet, and thank you very much, Chairman Joseph Zami-Tabone, and today specifically Ruben Miswood, who did so much to organize today's event. If you're not ready, may I encourage you to get in touch and join our network, the Malta Business Network, so we can come together and make a better business and indeed share more intelligence in helping stop cybersecurity. Join us also next week, June the 1st, for a riveting Zoom webinar presentation by Sir Max Hastings, celebrated historian, author, and journalist, who will be talking about the Santa Maria convoy featured in his new book. And the talk is being published on the 13th of May. Sir Max will be with us for questions and answers and session following the presentation. Dr. Jacqui Taylor and our panelists today, thank you very much for attending our webinar. Thank you for all the discussion. I see it's an excellent discussion today. For first time, I've witnessed some really good questions and really good engagement from our audience. And again, welcome to Malta Business Network. If you're not part of our network, you're more than welcome to join us to benefit not only from knowledge sharing from experts on cybersecurity, but also on other very important topics for your business. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you.